Thank you for this very insightful discussion. Some very interesting takeaways on the opportunities and access that Abu Dhabi presents for startups from across the world. Our next Abu Dhabi Decoded session, Investing in the Investor, will begin now.
Good morning again, Tamara and Ivo. It's been a while, and a lot has happened over the last years and weeks. It would be great for the audience if you could introduce yourselves very quickly. Tamara, if you can go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm Tamer Kadumi, and I am a founding partner at VentureSouk. We are a Dubai-based venture capital firm, and we invest into technology startups at the seed, Series A, Series B stage.
Ivo Detelenov, general partner at Hambro Perks Oryx Fund. It's a MENA dedicated fund to invest in seed and Series A stages across MENA.
Excellent. So it's been an interesting 7-8 years, and I'd love for the audience to hear the story that you've been through, each of you. Tamer, so I remember when I met you at MEVP 7-8 years ago, when you were an angel bringing other angels together, seeking extremely reduced or extremely low supply of opportunities, and how things have evolved. Walk us through your story and specific highlights, of course.
Yeah, sure. So we were born. Our group is very much a function of the place and time that we found ourselves in. Myself, the people who eventually became my partners in VentureSouk were kind of working professionals between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and just as a pastime, we started basically looking at and trying to help our friends who were starting their own companies. And so there was nothing structured. There was no even terminology that you would associate with what we were doing. But I got a buddy who is almost like on the side starting a little business, and is kind of like bootstrapping and looking to raise some money from other people in his immediate network to try to get it going. And I took part in that. And then I would brag to other people about how, I'm a shareholder in this company, and you would start seeing this kind of like organic interest in, I'd like to use my disposable income that I'm earning here in Dubai, and I'd like to put that into someone else's company. And that's how we started, was like a little club that would introduce friends of friends to one another, and then we would all sort of collectively get together and then pontificate, or ask what we thought were intellectual questions about what the founders of these companies were doing, and then evaluate, taking ourselves way too seriously, but just having fun on nights and weekends. That was in 2012, 2013, and then we kind of stuck with it. Basically, we there's been all sorts of permutations that we've gone through. But I like to say that where we've come since then, over 8, almost 9, almost 10. This year is going to be the 10th anniversary of us, hanging out together. We map to the trajectory of the regional ecosystem, I think. I mean, if you want to look at how the ecosystem is developed, you can look at a micro example, which is VentureSouk, and you can say, oh, that's indicative of what the rest of the market did. So I always kind of almost take pride in that. Yeah.
The average check you wrote in 2012 or 13 and the check you write now, What's the difference between the check then and the check now?
Yeah, we would do like, you know, $50,000 investments, you know, $100,000. We were doing good. Each person was putting, you know, let's say $5, $10, you know, $15,000, and we would sort of like club together. And now we like last year in 2021, we did a $12 million investment, which is like crazy, which is crazy. That's high for us. No one should think about us as people that go around writing $12 million checks, but we did, you know, make a $12 million investment last year. So that's like,
and there's, and you've seen that, and there's been enough demand or enough supply, let's say, to actually make that possible, because if you had $12 million in 2012-13, I'm not sure you would have found a single place to write a single check. Maybe Karim was probably the only thing available. Not even. Yeah, not even.
You know, you would have done something different. You know, you would have done kind of something that resembled more like a private equity buyout. You know, private equity. Yeah. You would have acquire an operating business. No, you wouldn't find a home for in the format that we invest now. You wouldn't have found a home for that.
On that format, I mean, Tamer and I have probably seen the locations where the capital and the entrepreneurs are coming first, but you've been in even new markets, even more frontier markets. Tell us about your story through that and how that's.
I mean, I joined Riyadh Capital in Riyadh in 2013, and you know, there wasn't much of an ecosystem at that time. So my entry in the venture space was a little more formal than Tamer's. I joined an asset management firm, which had a number of equity funds, sukuks, money markets. It didn't have an alternatives group, and that's where venture was supposed to be. So I started working on a project called the Riyadh Taqniya Fund, which took some time to structure, go through the regulator, the Capital Markets Authority, and then fundraise. And that fund was a reality, ready to invest and deploy in 2015, which at that time was meant to be one of the first, if not the first, GPLP institutional venture fund in the kingdom. And we started investing in Series A and Series B very, very conservatively, I should say, avoiding opportunities that are pre-revenue, certainly avoiding opportunities that are pre-license or pre-MVP. And we have seen the ecosystem mature to unrecognizable levels to bring it now to the present time in 2022. And that even includes 2 years of setback, if you will, the 2 years of the corona pandemic, which is to the month, actually today is 2 years. The ecosystem has matured in a number of ways, and I think all of them positive. First, the creation of many, many more funds, which over time will find their niche. Even though a lot of them look very similar today, this is an amazing start. So we should all be very proud and happy that we now have colleagues to bounce off ideas, brainstorm, and use as soundboard. I remember ArabNet conference and related other conferences had maybe a few hundred people, and we would be happy to see 10 startups. And you know, we've seen now conferences attended by 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, and hundreds of startups that you can't possibly meet in the context of the conference. So you mostly exchange cards and follow up later. Secondly, we've seen the introduction of sovereign funds and the role they've played in the ecosystem. One, by investing in funds and basically anchoring funds, including Oryx, but also investing in companies directly. And we've most recently seen renewed conviction or new conviction in leading B and C rounds, which is very, very good news for the ecosystem, because when we entered the space with Tamer, and we were doing seed and Series A investments, we had little knowledge who would take the companies forward beyond the Series A round. So we were doing what we were supposed to do. That was our mandate, create a fund and invest in Series A, but we didn't really have very good idea who would come in the B and C rounds. And now that uncertainty has been taken off the table with the sovereigns and international funds and corporates stepping up to the plate. And so as the ecosystem develops, I expect many good and better things to happen. I remember the ecosystem had volume of maybe a few $100 million, the whole GCC, and now we've reached 2 billion last year. Saudi itself reached 525 million. So I'm very happy and proud to have been part of the ecosystem. Of course, the challenges for us is to be able to identify the best and brightest so that we can deliver return to our shareholders and ensure the sustainability of our funds, because you can only be sustainable if you deliver the returns and make the impact that you said you would.
So I think let's refer to the venturing ecosystem, or at least the fund side of it, as a relay. We start, the first angel has to pass on the baton to a small VC, to a micro VC, to a bigger VC, and eventually to a sovereign, and even hopefully to an IPO. So that passing the baton, which requires much deeper capital pools, much deeper willingness of the entire kind of mainstream economy to enter this space is important. And that last week I met Mudassar, the Kareem founder, and he said one thing that stood out for me, and he said, for most large tech companies, it's the second decade that makes it, not the first decade. So the first decade you become a unicorn or whatever it may be, but the second decade is where the most value is created. And if you go back and you look at Amazon, Google, etc., and you'll see they got to $1 billion, and then they got to $1 trillion. So that $1 billion to $1 trillion is significant, right? So we're now getting to the beginning of the second decade, or soon we will be in the second decade of our industry. And maybe just as a background for the audience, I also started investing roughly the same time in the region in about 2012, and my first introduction was a startup that came to me and said, "Hey, we've got an investor. He's valuing us at $1 million." And I said, "Oh, that's great. And what's your profit or revenue, etc.?" And they said, "We make about $600,000 profit." And I was like, "What? And you're only being valued at $1 million and you're worth 600?" The investor was treating them as a traditional business. They were treating themselves as a traditional business. So I went in to rethink the term sheet. And in the process of rethinking the term sheet, thought, wow, this is too lucrative, I'm going to invest. So we completely changed the valuation from 1 million to 5 million within a matter of hours. Decided that the narrative needs to be much stronger to be called a tech player rather than just an entrepreneur with an idea. And from then on, I've seen today, if you try to find anything at $1 million profit, you wouldn't. I think even out of these hundreds of thousands of companies we see, I doubt we have one that is making $1 million profit or $600,000 profit at this stage. So not only has the narrative changed, the KPIs or the OKRs that the founders are going with, that the investors are going with, has changed. The acceptance to do pre-revenue or pre-profit or never profit or allowing leads to be a different shape is quite different. And the other thing is, those days it was nice to be an investor because everybody's excited, and the story that Tamar gave, it's fun. Everybody has a bit of FOMO. Now, as an angel, I'm scared because somebody later on comes and says, "I don't care about and it's happened a few times, what your pro rata rights are. If you want us in, we're going to have super pro ratas going forward. We're going to squeeze you. So there is a risk that some of the bigger boys, and I'm now almost referring to sovereigns, I'm not exactly sovereigns, but some of the bigger boys are being quite aggressive with the term sheets. So I think you have also the dangerous side of capital, not just the good side of capital. So for founders, they also have to think about the entire series, the first from Series A to Series E. How will it work? For investors like ourselves who come in very early, we have to think about who's the next one, how will we pass that relay baton on, and who will stay friendly with us across the board. We would love to stay with the journey. Of course, we will do secondaries, we'll drop out along the way. But some of the future investors also need to be supportive of the early stage investors. We've taken some high risks, etc. So any thoughts of that, Tamer, because you've kind of pushed your own journey through that as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack, but it's a very good point. I think the first thing to say is that like the more participation, the more activity, the more capital flows into this ecosystem, the better. Like, and that's a universal statement. Like that's not a qualified statement. That's not a however, there's no however, that's like full stop. More capital, the better, in my opinion. That being said, inside of the ecosystem, there will be posture, like the posturing and the sort of like the way to optimize your own, position inside of a company does need to be rethought, and it's very dynamic. And so, yeah, at the earlier stages, you need to do certain things. You need to sort of evolve the way that you're thinking about your participation to make sure that you're secured as bigger people come in. So yes, it's good that a big international company is coming in and wanting to, demanding that they take the entire round plus some. Well, okay, perhaps you should be thinking about your journey inside the company to like end at that stage. Perhaps you should recalibrate the way that you're thinking about risk and return, and because there's more, like fundamentally the risk that you're taking at this stage is significantly less because there's more availability of capital, and therefore if you should be comfortable making 10x and then exiting to the big guy who's now going to run the show instead of waiting for 100x. So you need to the different sort of like considerations of the people that are participating up the chain, they do change, and they necessarily will be dynamic as more and more capital comes into the ecosystem. But definitely there's posturing, and there's like alliances, and there's like, there's control, there's power moves, all of this stuff is happening now. It's actually like really exciting. And if you take a step back and sort of like look at it from a distance, sometimes we get sucked into this world, and you take a step back and you're like, that's really cool that's happening here. That's it's
a sport now.
Yes, I mean, but just like any industry. And I also do think that I guess it's somewhat related to your question, but you got to take a step back and see where you sit on the overall like pecking order of things, because sometimes I do successfully convince myself that what we're doing, we're at the center of the universe. Yes, this is everybody's top priority. Big corporates and governments and consumers and all anybody wants to talk about is start. It's just not the case. It's just not the case. Like playing in the seed to the Series B, Series C is one piece of a much bigger pie. And I think that Mudassir's comment to you is spot on. Like actually the real activity, the real attention span, the real money is when the companies are way beyond like our involvement. It's when our job is done and we've said congratulations and walked away is when the real exciting stuff happens. So you always got to
let's refer to the word frictions. So typically the founders are solving frictions for customers, for consumers, for the setup, and they do a great job, and we help to identify those. but for the founder's personal frictions typically are around funding. That's probably one of the biggest points where they are struggling. They're working, probably 5, 6, 7 years at very low pay, trying to make their valuations high to return the large growths that are expected out of them. And funding almost becomes like the last thing they think about, but also the first thing they think about. And it's one of the biggest frictions they keep facing. And the later they leave it, the lower the run rate is, the harder it becomes. Ivo, in the last 18 months, how have you seen this friction change for founders?
I think the best founders are now finding it a little easier to raise. I think they definitely see availability of capital that is there for the best companies. I also see companies that we, for some reason, passed on investing, actually raise, and that makes me happy. It's absolutely possible that we got this one wrong, but it's also possible that someone who perhaps didn't have the deal flow that we had considered this a perfectly doable and good investment, and maybe that will prove to be the case later on. So I do think that founders really struggled, let's say, around 2012 to the 14, 15 time frame, when there was just so few available pools of capital, mostly fragmented across the angel community, with no real leadership. We now have a lot more capital in the system, but also a lot more leadership as a quality in the venture community, with many more funds, including sovereigns, actually willing and able to lead. And so when we get involved in a transaction and we have our first org call, we always aspire to basically try to fund in, let's say, 45 days. And I can see and hear the founder gasps because they expect to fundraise for 5-6 months. And this is really value destructive to their businesses, to be involved in documentation and to be involved in negotiation with multiple capital providers over the period of half a year. So I do think that the friction has now kind of reduced, if you will, and I think the best founders not only are finding the capital, but they also select the investors that they want on their cap table. And then there is obviously a long tail of startups that still perhaps do not have their product in place. They do not have the team built out yet. And so they're not in a position to pick their investors, and they still continue to take a little bit longer than all of us want. But I will go back to my first point. I do think that as a whole, the friction is a bit less, and we're much more willing now to make decisions fast. We communicate better, hopefully. We fund fast. We are very collaborative on the deals that I have been involved on, the size of the ESOP, for example, where we set up KPIs for the founders. We work with them in a much more collaborative fashion than we are your only capital provider, so take it or leave it. Because when you actually finish an investment, you want everybody to walk away content, if not ecstatic, then content. But you definitely don't want someone to be disappointed or feel hurt.
So I'm going to refer to Tamer on the other sides of the friction. So we've got the capital frictions we used to have, and less so now, the kind of typical birth frictions around setting up companies, et cetera, for founders again. There's still frictions which are bureaucratic, especially in the fintech space or some of the other spaces where it's regulatory frictions, it's government-related frictions. It's also talent-related frictions, having a lack of talent in the region or attracting the talent. So given the roles that the government institutions, including Hub71, et cetera, are playing, what recommendations would you offer, or what have you seen? Because having seen what's worked at La French Tech or some of the other latecomers to the party in the Western world, and the French Tech is a good example. They moved in late, but they moved in consistently, aggressively across the entire value chain and across all frictions, from talent frictions to bureaucracy related to funding, etc. So anything you've seen work in the region, anything you would highlight, and also how can founders tap into that?
Yeah, the North Star, of course, is, it's like a lot of people spending a lot of time trying to advise on what the right regime is from a regulatory standpoint or an immigration and demographic movement of people standpoint, or support. A lot of people putting a lot of thought into that, when it's like the reality is like definitely less is more. That's the North Star, is like remove don't think what can I do to support, think what can I do to get out of the way. That's if you want to optimize for entrepreneurs to come in and build products that people who live in the country are like and use, and businesses are going to like and use, then that's the North Star. Think less about what I can do to help and think more about what I can do to get out of the way. I mean, that's frankly, that's the North Star. I think that in our part of the world, there is, and let's talk about the predominant Arabic first countries. Let's say there's 20 of them, and there's 400 million people in those. Well, you have phenomenal talent. You have phenomenally well-educated people. You've got tremendous resources, natural resources, wealth. You have geographic size. So if you look at it on the aggregate, you got everything that you need to just absolutely become a super interesting market that could produce many hundreds of unicorn companies. But they're all fragmented in their own, the concentration of one thing here and this here, and so that doesn't flow. So, but how do you just cut and it's the same thing. Less is more, less constraint between trade or flow of people from country to country that's what you want to get to. I can't suggest specific policy. I can't make specific policy recommendations, because there's very serious challenges in doing that. But the North Star
lower the barriers, lower the transaction barriers.
Build a canal between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi and Casablanca, that just allows people to just go back and forth, products to go back and forth without any, just the same way that it would move from Florida to Georgia. So that's the North Star, of course.
Since we have very little time left, I would say there's one part of the ecosystem that hadn't stepped in until very recently. So we've had all the funds starting to step in. We've had the sovereigns starting to step in. What's more recent and has become more and more regular is the large corporates or the enterprises or even government-related institutions that are not venture funds per se. So two things they're stepping in two ways. In the past, on the product side, as B2B customers or B2G customers, they were still very cautious of using a startup as the vendor. They were cautious across the board, conservative in the sense, what if this vendor disappears, cannot survive, or what if the product cannot be customized to us? We're better off from a procurement to use a big international company versus a small local company. So all those barriers are being broken. And now slowly, so once they're seeing that and they're seeing the fruit of having really relevant product market fit, because it's done by people who understand the requirements, exactly what Tamara was pointing out, etc. So that's one element. The second element is now they're using that to also potentially invest and put their capital into this ecosystem. Do you see, Ivo, do you see that coming into play?
I mean, we talk to a lot of corporates all the time. We want to engage them, usually without an agenda. We just want to understand how much they know about venture. Have they done anything? Do they plan to do anything? And then somewhere in there is obviously the opportunity for them to co-invest alongside with us or in us, or both of these things. And I have to tell you that the banks, the telecoms, the big mall operators, the big food retailers, and the property operators, I mentioned that already, are actually all looking, with probably the banks being on the forefront of that, and recognizing that it's a question of not just getting a competitive edge, but probably long-term survival. So we talk to a lot of banks, and many of them are creating fintech vehicles, some of them open to outside investors, some of them entirely backed by a single LP, that being the bank's balance sheet, and looking at fintechs. And it's a trial and error. Banks usually would want exclusivity. The fintechs will push back. They will not want to be exclusive with one bank. But I think we will get it right, because we are seeing all the early signs of this willingness to innovate. And hopefully one entity that we didn't mention in this discussion that I was hoping we do is the regulators and the cooperation between the regulators. Because it's one thing if a bank wants to work with a fintech, but if the bank has offices in 3, 4, 5, 6 countries in the Gulf, it's actually not easy to scale that fintech. Probably in a bank's case, it's easy because the bank's license could be utilized. But if the fintech is not associated with a bank,
so I think
then it's actually imperative that the regulators work together to help reduce the time to scaling across the region.
Yeah. I think Tamer described let's call it the passporting that the regulator also needs to support with.
Yes. But I do see good signs from the corporates, actually.
Okay, so I was asking the world's oldest venture fund, which I assume is Sequoia or the likes of Sequoia, and I said, you must have seen all this over 40, 50 years, how it matures, etc. And the reason for the question was I felt there's significant inflation in the startup valuations, and how will that work out going forward, next round. And of course, the answer came back very clearly that says, look, the loser in this space is not the startups, is the loser, the traditional corporates who are not evolving, because basically their cake will be eaten. So yes, maybe the pie might not grow significantly, but there's somebody who's losing from that pie, and it's not the startups. So I think the corporates do need to attend. Tamer, any last views on that?
Yeah, I think you said it well, but my observation is that valuation has jumped. Recently we've seen, wow, look at these things. It is not untethered from the growth in market share of these companies. Like you think that valuation, doubling or doubling in the course of a year is crazy. Look at how quickly the user base or top line revenue or GTV of these companies is growing, and then then make that same assessment as to whether valuations. It is not. It may seem like it's egregious how high valuations are. They are not, generally speaking, untethered from that how quickly they are growing, and so that's a super interesting observation, I think.
So I think as a last thing for the finance side of the world is increasing the pace of decision making, whether you're sitting in an investment committee or a CFO position, etc. Those days of taking months to make decisions down to a few weeks ago, there was one particular fund that invested in a startup. Having met them in the afternoon, by evening they got a $2 million term sheet. So it's gotten to that point where speed is important. Otherwise, you're just left out. Or the valuation gets out of control. Any last comments, any positive thoughts for people who are first time putting money into this ecosystem, whether they're individuals or they're large corporates or governments? Ivo?
I would say engage deeply, and engage in directions that are not necessarily leading to someone investing in you. And that actually I'm speaking for both founders as well as VC fund managers. Just engage with give your time to universities, speak to their endowments, speak to corporates, speak to regulators, go to roundtable discussions, and naturally engage with your own community. If you're a founder, speak to founders who have raised, speak to founders who haven't raised, and learn from every conversation. Go to events, be very, very generous with your time. And I think by doing that, you're building an ecosystem, writing history, if you will, and capital will flow to you. And that actually goes, again, to be clear, both for founders on the one hand and for VC managers on the other. We still have very fragmented conversations. We check in, if we can get money, we run to the next one. We don't actually understand the mandate. We don't understand the pain point of the other party. We still can work on collaboration and working together more. We've gone a long way, but we can still do more. And I'm actually very, very optimistic with the funding volume, with the composition, with the players, with the quality of the startups, with the founders. And of course, we'll have problems. Of course, some deals will take 3 months plus. Of course, some positions will remain unfilled. Of course, your CTO will jump ship for 50% raise at a company across the street. These are normal things. But I think we've gone a very long way.
So Tamer, just very quickly, 20 seconds if possible.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, what we are doing, what this ecosystem is good. There is balanced, balanced participation, balanced leverage. There's no I don't see a high prevalence of like bad actors. Everyone is trying to build products that are positive, and that's really rewarding. So I would echo what Ivo says, and both as the imperative. Yeah, we got to support, but also because it's a good thing. It's a good thing. You feel good about yourself if you're giving time to this.
So thank you all. I guess I also like to leave it with the statement to say, when it's so much fun with so many good actors and we're engaging, makes it fun and intellectually energizing. It's amazing. And these founders, they give us energy. It's a bit like being with a baby that's laughing, right?
Absolutely.
You bring that energy into the world. So,
absolutely.
So great. Thank you all, and hope we meet again and talk about some of the interesting investments we've made recently.